Neoconservatism is a term not often heard on the legacy government media, but among those in the know, it is used to describe the foreign policy of the United States, which is used to interfere in the affairs of foreign governments, foment foreign rebellion, bring in regime change, and often conduct war, all in the name of promoting democracy. Russian President Vladimir Putin has used it to blame the United States and its neocons, like Victoria Nuland, for the current conflict in Ukraine, which has resulted in 1 million casualties. Here to help us understand the root of this ideology is Professor Salim Mansur. Welcome, Salim.
Thank you, Robert.
Salim, what is neoconservatism?
Well, as you just said in your opening remarks, neoconservatism can be defined, if I may use that word, or described as the current state of American foreign policy that began in the last century. So we are dealing with the legacy of the 20th century in the 21st century, which is what Putin is saying. But beyond the question of American foreign policy as defined by neoconservatism and neocon, the deeper question is, what does neocon represent? Where did it come from? And how did it arrive at this present time to basically control, direct, execute American foreign policy as a policy of the uniparty, that is both the parties, Democrats and Republicans. So my view is that you cannot define something that is as amorphous, as pervasive as is what neocon and neoconservative has become.
Okay, well, we can either do this one of two ways, Salim. We can get into the philosophy of it. And for me, when I was reading about it, I went all the way back to Plato and the Noble Lie, wherein he describes to Socrates, or has Socrates describe in his Socratic method, an elite, that there are those born to be guardians, is the word that he used. And that elitism, and matter of fact, you can see behind me here, there's Aristotle and Plato. That image captures everything that has been philosophic and ideological since Plato and Aristotle. So we go back to the noble lie, and it is a lie that there are those born to govern, those born to lead and to be the guardians. And this comes into what we call American exceptionalism, a more recent term in the political discussion, whereby the United States has set itself up as the moral vanguard of democracy in the world, not just within its own sphere, but in the world. And it has gone out and sought monsters and demons everywhere. And in its wake is untold death and destruction, and very little democracy, as in a Jeffersonian sense. So, Salim, do you want to go back all the way back to Plato and go from there? Or do you want to jump in right into more current philosophers like Leo Strauss and some of the movers and shakers, Charles Krauthammer, for example? Or do you want to go down the other way and let's look at Ukraine and look at the results of their regime changes, Libya, Iraq, the conflict, which may blow up in Taiwan over democracy. So how do you want to handle this?
Well, in a sense, you have laid the groundwork, Robert. Noble lie is always around us. I mean, it was proposed, propounded, and presented by Plato in his Republic. So that is taking us to go back to its correct. And it is by Alan Bloom, I mean, that edition. So who was Alan Bloom is another question to ask. It goes back 2,500 years and is one of the foundational documents of, his Republic is one of the foundational documents of Western thought, Western philosophy, right? I mean, he is the beginning. And he's basically reporting on Socrates and then Aristotle. Again, the question of noble lie in the Platonic sense is that the elect, and the elect, in the sense, the philosophical elect, the philosopher king, is separate from the masses. The masses do not understand. They do not know. It is only the elect who has the true understanding of nature, the true understanding of the idea, the true understanding of concepts. And so the elect, by the virtue of their knowledge, their understanding, uh, are born to lead the masses. And the masses have to be told or have to be presented with what they can comprehend given their limitation in terms of their situation in life, their origin, their birth, the work they do. So let's say the peasants. So it is the elect presents to them um, the fables, the stories, the legends by which the masses come to see who their progenitors were, and they, the progeny, the children of the people who brought the golden fleece, for example, if you go back to the Greek legends and mythology. So that is the role of the elect. They're born to be. This is not simply with Plato and his Republic. It is found in just about every civilization, I would say. And civilization is constituted by different cultures. So within the Western culture, one of the students of Plato who became the godfather of neocons and neoconservatives was a German-born political philosopher who emigrated with his family to United States in the late 1920s or early 1930s with the coming of Hitler to power in Germany. They were Jews. And the man I'm referring to is Leo Strauss, who was born in 1899, died in 1973. He spent more than 3 decades in University of Chicago, where he cultivated a whole band of students who later on, and as we go into this discussion, would become the foundational actors, thinkers, executors of what has now come to be called neoconservatism, and these people neocon. Alan Bloom, the book that you held up, was a student of Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss, among his writing and thinking, his contribution propounded that there is a very special way to read and comprehend ancient philosophers. And his point was that there is, I say this is the noble lie, that this is what you read of Plato, what you read of the others after Plato, and then in the birth of the modern age, when you're reading people like Machiavelli and Hobbes and so on and so forth, the philosopher is writing in a language which has an outer meaning, an exoteric meaning, and then has an inner meaning, an esoteric meaning. So again, we are back to noble lie. The outer meaning is for the common man, the people who are not specialists, who do not understand. But it is the task of the philosopher to understand the esoteric meaning, the inner meaning. So that is the noble lie. There is a difference, okay? So these are again, basis of philosophical discussion, how to do the interpretation, that is the exegesis, whether we are dealing with philosophers like Plato or whether we are dealing with theologians, or whether they're Christian theologian, Jewish theologian, Muslim theologians, and so on and so forth, to find out the internal meaning, what it is. And it is in that internal meaning is the secret of the elect, because they only know what nature is. So just let me shift the gear. The elect on the other side of the aisle, what became the Marxist movement, the Marxist philosopher, Marxism, Leninism, and then Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Trotskyism, Maoism, etc., etc. Well, the foundational basis from Marx downward is there is an elect. They will be the leaders. With the revolution that Lenin brought about, there is the whole structure of the Communist Party. There is the Politburo, and then the Politburo has committees, and the committees then elect the Secretary General, who becomes the Pope of the party. So Lenin was the Pope. There was a conflict between Stalin and Trotsky, who will be the Pope, and one man emerged as the leader of that struggle. So Stalin became the Pope. Similarly, in China, there was a struggle. Mao became the Pope, and so on and so forth. And so they are the guardian. They are the ones who define what is the sacred understanding, in this case, of Marxism as a science of what is capitalism, what will be socialism, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there is the noble lie that we deal with, and in the modern term, we can come back to it. And then there are the people. Who are these people? We know who Plato was. We know who Socrates was. But who are the neocons? Where did they come from? So I think those are the two elements that have to be talked about, and then they narrow and come into play, as you just again laid out, in the Reagan administration. The last American administration of the Cold War years. And with the departure of Reagan, ironically, the Cold War came to an end. So, as I noted, neocons and neoconservatives are the legacy of 20th century American history. And in that sense, also world history, but America became the dominant power.
Now, who were these people? Now, I understand that right around the time of Strauss's death in 1973, there became a group of people loosely associated who started to put out writings that started to formulate a foreign policy in the United States that would get us involved in, or by us, I mean the West, involved in wars like Vietnam, Libya, Iraq, and you just name it. Like, for example, the United States has approximately 800 military bases and installations throughout the world. By comparison, Canada has two, Germany and Kuwait. The United States, 800, give or take, installations. In Syria, they have 2,000 troops on the ground and have for quite a while. Against, by the way, without the invitation of the Syrian government, let's call it a special military operation, United SMO in Syria. These kinds of activities started around that era, around the Vietnam War era. And we have people today like the Victoria Nuland. We have, let me just throw out some names to you, and maybe you can chime in as to who are these movers and shakers in the neocon field. Irving Kristol, sometimes called the godfather of neoconservatism, and he wrote The Neoconservative Persuasion back in 2003. Paul Wolfowitz, Norman Podhoretz, he wrote The Present Danger, 1980. Jean Kirkpatrick, everybody remembers Jean Kirkpatrick. Dictatorship and Double Standards, she wrote in 1979. Project for the New American Century, which is a document, PNAC it's called, back in 1997, has been taken to be the Mein Kampf, if you will, of neoconservatism. So who of these people would you consider to be the movers and the shakers and the real influencers in this foreign policy of the United States?
Right. you mentioned Vietnam War, so we're going back to the 1960s. If you construct a timeline, you might say that neocons became an identifiable cabal. And I take the word cabal from one of the finest, if not the definitive books. By the way, there's a vast literature on neocons and neoconservatism, which the legacy media, like everything else in the real world, ignores, suppresses, or airbrushes away, and constructs their reporting of news and current affairs as narrative. So the legacy media doesn't use the word neocons and neoconservatism, right? It is interesting that this word now is going to reverberate more and more around the world, perhaps not in United States, of course not in United States, and in Canada, which, by the way, you and I have talked about it. I have talked about it and written about it. Canada is a vassal state. So we will not, because the Canadian politics is also completely, in a sense, taken over by the neocons, the Canadian version of the neocon, and we can get into that in our discussion as we move forward. But for the rest of the world, the global south, for instance, which is 80% of the world, the Putin's statement is going to reverberate, and they're going to ask the questions, and it is going to come back, to what we are talking about: where, how, who are they, and so on and so forth. So, 1960s, Vietnam War, in the timeline is, you might say, the coming together or the beginning of what is called the transparent cabal. It is in this book by Stephen Snugosky, who goes into the history of these people, these collection of Americans. There is the other book, just for, again, our audience, if they want to pursue their own investigation, is the book by John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer and Professor Stephen Walt. Mearsheimer is University of Chicago, and Stephen Walt is Harvard University. Their book, The Israel Lobby, that created a huge consternation. It came out in 2008, if I remember, and it continues to create consternation, and the mainstream media is not going to talk about it. But it is, again, two very eminent academics in the American system, both coming from Ivy League school, Chicago and Harvard, and they documented evidence of what the title of the book is, The Israeli Lobby, which in effect means the people and the policies of the neocons. So yes, so 60. But 60 did not arrive as a bolt from the blue. So history is a continuum. What happened in the 60s now has its origin going further back. So I would say, as I've been saying in this little exchange that we're having, neocon and neoconservatism is the legacy of the 20th century political history and ideological battles of the 20th century in America. And we are dealing with that phenomena now, 1/4 of the way into the 21st century. So something that you appreciate, and I appreciate, and I think all people who study history and ideas appreciate, is that ideas have consequences. And so ideas have the origin. The origins of the ideas are in terms of context. They're played out in history, and then many different versions emerges. I mean, Marxism sprouted in a sense from the head of Marx, but the Chinese Marxists are different from the Russian Marxists. There was a great split that took place in the 1950s between Khrushchev and Mao and so on and so forth. The Chinese Marxists, Leninists, Maoists fought against the Vietnamese after the end of the Vietnam War, in 1979 and so on and so forth. Well, back to again, if you say Christianity, it has many versions and they fought against each other and split. Same thing in Islam and so on and so forth. So I would say that let us take a very quick glance at the history before 1960 and the history after 1960. 60 is the benchmark. It's the sort of thing where the idea split and two tributaries grow. So what's the beginning of the 20th century in American history in terms of foreign policy? World War One. So at the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of World War I, 1914, that is in Europe, America went through a massive transformation. This is
I think you mean World War II in 1940.
World War I, 1865 to 1914.
Right.
I'm saying 20th century history. The 20th century history, what propels America into the world stage. America was World War I. Before World War I, America was emerging as the dominant power in the Americas, in the New World. The founding of America took place in the New World, 1776, and so on and so forth, that broke away from the Old World. The farewell message of George Washington was, do not get entangled in the affairs of the Old World. In this late 1700s and the early 1800s, the old world was avoided by the American presidents. It was about building America. Whatever language was used, if it is a beacon on the city on a hill, that became the favorite metaphor of President Reagan in 1980. The founders of the American Republic was concerned about building America in terms of the values that they brought or their ancestors brought from the old world. But here in the new world, the Puritans would say in the new world they were building a Zion, and so on. And we can go into that language of the Puritans, the Pilgrim Fathers who arrived on, the Mayflower in 1630 in New England. They called it New England, that's Massachusetts, and they set up the colony. But fast forward to where I'm, again, putting the timeline, the end of the Civil War. The Civil War was one of the greatest trauma, but also, in a sense, the completion of the American promise. That is, all men are born equal, etc., in the Declaration of Independence. But the Republic, all men were not equal. In 1776, America was still a slave society. It took a civil war to bring to completion what Abraham Lincoln called in his famous Gettysburg Address, the whole idea of one people, one nation, and a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So what began in 1776 was completed in the Civil War. Slavery was ended, blacks were emancipated. The trauma of the Civil War, it was the first industrial war in the modern world, and almost, 600,000 plus Americans died in that war. So it was a very traumatic experience, and it still remains in the minds of Americans, who look back to it. There's still the divide between what Confederacy represented and what the Union represented and the Yankees. So that is the context. And then after the war, 1865, America goes into the Reconstruction, and it's a Reconstruction boom. And by the time the century ends and the new century begins, America has become a power, a power that is not in play in the old world, but it is a power that nobody can ignore, and it is going to get into play. But this period is also a period of new immigration. And especially between the 1880s and the beginning of World War One, because after World War One or during World War One, there was a moratorium that closed the door to immigration from the old world. The immigrants were coming not in flying in a wide-body jetliner 747, having, as I wrote in my book, having breakfast in Karachi or in Mumbai and landing in Toronto or in New York for dinner. This was a huge traumatic experience of immigration from the old world to the new world. And so the people who came from the old world were basically European. And a large majority or chunk of the people who came from East Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, were people of a different culture, different religion, and they were not part of the people who had built America. The culture of America through the Civil War into the 20th century was WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You know, John F. Kennedy would be the first Catholic president, and he had to go through an immense challenge to become a candidate and then to win the presidency. So it was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the largest ethnic group in this population that built America, from Pilgrim Fathers downwards, was ironically German American. Pennsylvania was a colony of German Americans, German and Dutch Americans, So they were Protestants, they were Lutherans, they were Calvinists, but Europeans, but they came to America and they became Americans. I mean, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a German by descent, and so on and so forth. I mean, Pennsylvania, if you travel to Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that was inhabited and built by German Americans. So ethnically, this was the largest group. And then around them, there were the Irish, the English, the Scots, and so on and so forth. But they were all American, and they became American. This was a new identity. So in the period after 1880s, as the new immigrants arrived from the old world, they were largely Italians, from middle of Europe, and then from Eastern Europe. And among the Eastern Europe were the Jews. So they're culturally different, linguistically different, religiously different, and so on. So this new arrivals would, in time, as it happens in every circumstances of immigration, would change the profile, the demographic profile of America. The question of assimilation, the question of how they're going to play the role, how they're going to identify themselves and build their politics and so on. But from a political point of view, how they're going to be absorbed by which political parties and which political party they will find their homes in. And so this vast number of new immigrants who doesn't speak English, who are going to be the workers, who are going to be joining the demand for industrial workers in the northeast corner of America where the industries are situated, where, again, we talk about, in this sense, particular sense, the Jews, they became a factor, a very important factor, and they were absorbed into the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party. So they became members. That's how the Democrat Party emerged in the 20th century as a party that became a contestant for national power. Remember, 1860s, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. He is the father or the founder of the grand old party called the Republican Party, the party with the emblem of elephant. There it is. From the 1860s into 1912 election, it's all Republicans. Why? Because the Democrats were Southerners. They were the slaveholders. They were the party of the Confederacy. They would become the party of the KKK. Woodrow Wilson himself came from a borderline state. So we have to keep these in mind in the construction of what happens and how these ideas came forward. So Democrats look towards the new immigrants to give them the vote. They would become their mentors. They would bring them into America, and they would. Well, Robert, isn't that what we're seeing again today? That's the legacy. Open borders in the South in America. Bring in the population. They will give the vote to the Democrats, and they will make the Democrats or the Democratic Party basically the dominant one party. That's that's taking place in Canada. You know, so as we see, I mean, the Canadian context, we say in the 20th century, the Liberal Party became the natural governing party. The Liberal Party became the party of the immigrants. The Democratic Party became the party of the immigrants in America. And one of the most important elements of this new demography was going to be the role of the Jewish American Jews.
You'll notice, Salim, it hasn't gone unnoticed by me at least that what these proponents of neoconservatism throughout the world are trying to enforce or to promulgate throughout the world is democracy, democratic party. They're not necessarily trying to foist upon the world freedom. They're not foisting upon the world American republicanism, that form and system of government. They're trying to impose upon the world democracy. And I had to ask myself the question, what is it about democracy that these elite, because they don't believe in democracy, what is it about democracy that they're trying to foist upon the world? And it occurs to me, living in a parliamentary democracy here in Canada, watching the elections in the United States and abroad in UK, etc. One of the thing about democracy is that the fourth estate, the press, the journalists, tell the people what they need to know and who to vote for. And as long as you can control that fourth estate, you've controlled the vote. You've controlled the people. You've controlled that dem part of democracy. And so that's why I think it's a little esoteric. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it's a little esoteric that the elite that we're talking about want to push democracy because that is the mechanism that they can control. That is the mechanism that they use in the United States and in the West, and now trying to do it throughout the world, to keep a certain cabal of elitists in power and control for their own self-aggrandizement, or because they have it in their head, just like what Plato said, they're the ones that have gold in their system. Am I wrong? Is this just a little too nuanced or esoteric to think that what they're trying to push is democracy instead of freedom, and there's a good reason for that?
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. You began
Okay.
by, and by the way, we're not discussing mathematics, that there will be only, a binary answer, right or wrong, we are discussing history and ideas, and neoconservatism in terms of ideas, and ideas don't sprout in a vacuum. It sprouts in a context, and it sprouts in the heads of people. And so to understand that, so I mean, democracy, what you're talking about is in the manner you're talking about is just, as you would say, just right, because what we again go back to its origin, Genesis, and one of the things we do when we're talking about concepts and ideas, we go back to the genesis of the ideas, so the people. So the genesis of the demo is a Greek word, demo, people, kresi, the rule or the government or the people, and we go back to Aristotle, who used it, and he categorized it. What is the best form of government and what is the worst form of government. And in the Politics of Aristotle, the book that he wrote called Politics, for Aristotle, who was in a sense the first scientist, politics in human affair was the queen of all subject, because it brought every idea, everything from technology, science to religion, culture, mythology together. So that's where the role of the noble lie becomes important, because the masses don't understand all of these things. So it is incumbent upon the elect, as you say, who is going to bring all of these things together and guide the masses as a shepherd guides the sheep.
And
You
what
know,
got me onto this, Salim, was when you're talking about when these intellectuals start to promote these ideas of neoconservatism. What party did they join as immigrants? They joined the Democratic Party, the party of slavery, the party of elites over others, quite literally using a whip. So isn't it? I guess it's only natural that we see these elites going to the Democratic Party, but then what do they do? In more modern history, and I don't want to stop. I know that you're progressing through history and you're going past the Civil War, but I have to jump in with this because I don't want it to be lost. That the neoconservatism is a word that has been used to describe these Democrats who are not conservatives, and it's now a new conservatism. They've usurped the word and the concept of conservatism to destroy that concept. When you put an adjective in front of a concept, you basically destroy it. Like social justice means no justice, you know. So you have neoconservatism, which is not conservatism. What conservatism did they destroy? Conservatism in the American sense used to mean not necessarily total isolationism, but it was more in the Washington Adams sense of we do not go out seeking monsters to destroy. That is a conservative viewpoint. The neoconservatives are simply liberals, Democrats. Again, you tell
yeah.
me, am I on point?
No, no, no. I mean, again, this has to be fleshed out. You see, I mean, when you use the word democracy and in this conversation, and you made the points about uh, democracy, elect and people and the form of government. So I take it back to, and you are familiar with it, back to Aristotle. The best form of government is, in a sense, monarchy or aristocracy, under one leader. And that is consistent with Plato's position of the the philosopher king, So, and the king will be surrounded by the elect to guide the king where the king needs it. So it is not a government or a rule of the masses, because what are the masses? They're sheep, they're cattle, in this construct. But that's 2,500 years old construct, and it goes through changes. So if you're coming to the period that we are talking about, the great immigration into America, and it is a new, the profile of America is changing as new immigrants from different cultures with different backgrounds, with different languages, come to a society which is new to them, but they're coming for, again, a whole spectrum of reason why they're coming to. But one of the reasons they're coming to, individually or in groups and numbers, is because they're seeking a better life, economically, in terms of they're looking for peace where they can grow with their children, from the places of conflict. The old world was entangled in conflict, religious conflict, ethnic conflict, If you go through, again, by centuries and by decades, from the period of the Pilgrim Fathers to the period of World War I, Europe is an endless conflict. I mean, people sit today and watch television and say, oh my God, the Middle East, they are savage people. The people who make those comments are people with total lack of historical knowledge. Well, those people are the masses, are the sheep, because they don't know. But the neoconservative know, because the neoconservative are looking at the conflicts of Africa or the conflicts of the Middle East or of Southeast Asia, and to the extent they know is that their ancestors were fleeing from those conflicts. You see, so the idea that the new people who are going to come and will immediately embrace in the place where they have arrived the history, the culture, the language of their new home is, a demand that cannot be fulfilled. Individuals might, assimilate, but numbers, it takes time. So the world, before World War I, and we are talking about America specifically, was America built by a population who came from the western seaboard of the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't come from the inner portions of Europe or Eurasia. So they were, as I said, German were the largest ethnic group, and the surrounding areas, the Anglo-Saxon, and so WASP, Anglo-Saxon, and religiously Catholic, Protestant. So it is their culture that built America. It is their ideas that went through the process of Enlightenment philosophy that constructed the foundation of what America would be, that is, the United States of America, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, that the founding documents of America is completely alien to somebody who's coming from the ghettos of Eastern Europe. Just like somebody's coming from the mountains of Afghanistan arriving today, what do they know about Canada? Right? So they are a number then. And number, what is democracy? It is simply an arrangement, a system of arrangement by a people to their own consensus of what sort of rule they're going to establish. People, one group of people, that is one in terms of ethnicity, in terms of kinship, in terms of their ideology, religion, etc., can say the best government we have will be our king, our nobility. So somebody like you or me sitting here in Canada turn around and say, what backward people they are. They have monarchy. But no, to them, being their system of government is best for them, and they respect the man whom they have chosen out of their own consensus to be the king, King Arthur, King Alfred, and so on and so forth down the line. But when the very people who made the American Revolution, the 13 colonies, came together and were going through the process of creating the new system that is going to take the place of the system that they had destroyed through the War of Independence, they offered to George Washington the crown, and George Washington said no. So the new system of government is a consensus government, and the Constitution and the framework that is written, and it becomes a republic. It takes time to know that. And so, as I said, the second revolution was the Civil War, and it is a Republican precedent, because he created the Republican Party, is Abraham Lincoln, who gives the definition, the second definition of the founding document, that this is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's democracy. It's a people's government. But a people's government bound and shackled in the constitutional sense by the founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution.
It doesn't mean mob rule, in other words.
It's not a mob rule, because there is no reference in the documents to the word democracy, right? But then the word democracy do come into play, because the third president of America, the first Secretary of State of America, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence of America, Thomas Jefferson, is the father of the Democrat Party. He's coming from the South, Virginia. So is George Washington. So both of them are slaveholders. right? So this is what it is. But then they're also federalists. So, this is the American. So what does a man from the ghetto or a family from the ghetto of Poland and East and Russia and so on and so, what the heck do they know about American history? So now in the post-Civil War period, the Democrats are the second party. They cannot elect a president. They're burdened with the shackles of the Civil War. They are the party that had basically led the Confederates. They are the party that did not accept the changes that came around. So now how are they going to get to power? Well, they embraced the new immigrants. Why didn't the Republican Party embrace the new immigrants? Well, they were in power. They were comfortable in terms of the American sense.
It
You
should be
know,
noted, Salim, if I may interject, that Jefferson himself, while he did own slaves, rejected slavery, and in his Declaration of Independence, the first draft, he had emancipated the blacks, but unfortunately it was told upon him that this will not fly, so he had
correct.
to take it out. Just to put that in there.
Correct. So, I mean, it is, again, history is very complex. Um, Jefferson was more of a radical than was John Adams. When John Adams became the second president and Jefferson became the vice president, they were philosophically incompatible because John Adams was a conservative Christian. Jefferson was a radical in the context of that time to whom Christianity was just a legend. The man was reading the Bible with a scissor just as he was reading the Quran with a scissor.
Yes, the Jeffersonian Bible, yes.
And the Quran.
Yes.
That's the Jefferson Quran. And he was a man of enlightenment. So, he was living the life in the immediate post Newton life, the new sciences, the new philosophy. This was the man. And then he goes to France as the representative of the colonies during the War of Independence. And that's where he is engaged with the revolutionaries. Not only him, his very close comrade Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, all of these people were supporters of the French Revolution. They were reading Rousseau. They were reading Montesquieu. So you see, they were reading Voltaire. Whereas George Washington was a loyal, you know, Anglo-Saxon, you might say monarchist, but it was what happened under George III that broke out as a revolution, and George Washington joined the revolution and became the head of the army, Continental Army. However, the people like George Washington was in Canada who refused to join that. We could have become part of America. That is, the Canadians would have become Americans or become joined, and we would have been part of the states that form, which now President-elect Donald Trump is raising. It's history is amusing. But history is necessary to put in context what has happened. So going back to it, these were the raw materials coming in as the demography was beginning to change in the urban centers, the industrial towns of New York, of Pennsylvania, of Connecticut, and so on and so forth. As they were changing, these were the raw material they recruited. The Republicans didn't recruit them, didn't go forward to them, because they were the moneyed class. They were the traditionalists. They were the defenders of the Constitution, and they were pro-capitalist. Very important in capitalism. The new people who were coming in and who the Democrats recruited to be the fodder for the Democratic Party, that is for the vote for the Democratic Party, it is the second and the third generation of these people who will come to play into the play in the period after the Second World War. We're coming the timeline to 60s. So condensing it together, these new immigrants who then eventually became voting population as they became citizen, recruited by the Democrats, would then rise within the ranks of democratic politics into position of influence within the local communities. And the Democrats would take them and put them in significant position so that they can then attract the new immigrants coming in, because again it's a question of ethnicity and language and so on and so forth. And the Democrats did that. The Republicans didn't do that in the manner in which the Democrat went out and looked for them. And so you see, when a marriage takes place, let's put it in the raw sense. When a black individual, a white individual marries a black individual, whichever way it is, man or woman, the offspring is neither black nor white. It is a mix. It's a dilution, right? So when a marriage takes place, or when a union takes place, when people come together, the Democrat Party, the party of slave, is now recruiting the people from old Europe, that is, ethnically they may be white, but they're of a different background in terms of their own culture, recruiting them. And in the process of the mixing, the Democratic Party also begins to change.
You have to hand it to them, Salim, that the Democrats, as a political ideology and philosophy, have been very successful.
Yeah, yeah.
Very successful. As a matter of fact, what they did, and I've been reading up on this, what strikes me the most is that the nature of the United States as a republic, right? You have the House of Representatives representing the people, and you have the Senate representing the states.
States, yeah.
It used to be, though, although not for every state, it used to be that the senators were elected by the state legislatures, and therefore they were distinct from the House of Representatives in that they were not beholden to the people at large. They were beholden to the governor of the state and the state legislature.
Right.
Something that the Democrats have changed. And now the rule is that all senators must be elected at large by the people at large. So the republic has been diluted.
Precisely. So you see, exactly, you're pointing out to the way that American constitutional arrangement was being softened up. Now, you might argue, someone might argue, and the argument will be, in my view, quite correct, that these were done on the basis of expediency to gain power and influence, But as I said in my opening remark, ideas have consequences. So what is inexpedient have unintended consequences over time, and things change. When Woodrow Wilson, to consolidate his position as a Democratic leader, when he was running in the 1912 election, he won the nomination. He was reaching out to these new immigrants, and in the process, he leaned upon the man who he got to know as a leader of these new immigrants, that is in the Jewish segment of the new immigrant population, Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis was a lawyer practicing law which was heavily focused on trade unionism, that is in the support of the workers for better wages, better housing, and so on and so forth. And so he was representing the newcomers into America and working to help these people overcome the hurdles. But Louis Brandeis was a Jew from Eastern Europe. I mean, his parents, they came from Bohemia, from Prague, in the period immediately after Civil War. So he was born in America, he grew up in America, and so by the time we are coming into the 20th century, World War I, he's a very successful lawyer practicing in the East Coast. I think it was in New York, but I could be mistaken. And he would eventually be the first man that Woodrow Wilson appointed to the Supreme Court as an associate justice. This is the first Jew appointed to the United States Supreme Court as an unelected position. It is the highest position one is getting appointed to, and will become very influential. As we know, the Supreme Court is the ultimate court that decides what is constitutionally right or wrong, or what sort of adaptation can take place in the Constitution.
Let me just interject here for a second against Salim as the thought enters my mind, is that just as the Democrats changed the nature of the republic by allowing the senators to be elected at large, what have we heard of late? They wanted to abolish the Electoral College. They wanted to expand the number of judges on the Supreme Court. Two more fundamental changes that the Democrats are trying to push to destroy the American Republic. I'll just throw that in there. Please continue.
On the mechanism of the Constitution, but it is also in the arena of the civil life, the society. I mean, one of the most significant, if not the most significant, policy that was put through the Supreme Court was on the question of abortion. And it was defended by justices in the Supreme Court of Jewish background. The most famous being Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose seat when she died was taken by, I believe, Amy Coney Barrett, nominated by Donald Trump and voted by the Senate. So you see, these are what is at play in terms of ideas, in terms of neoconservatism. Louis Brandeis is extremely important because what he did or was able to do in the position that he was put in by Woodrow Wilson is going to reverberate down the 20th century into our time. Because it was Louis Brandeis who was instrumental in getting Woodrow Wilson after his re-election. He ran for his re-election in 1916 election, saying he will not take America to war. And in those days, the inauguration used to take place. The election happened in November, the inauguration happened in March. And he immediately after inauguration, the first thing that he did was to ask the Congress to declare war on Europe and took America into war. And it was Louis Brandeis who was instrumental in doing that, in the sense the British were working through him. And what the British was promising, and Brandeis became the conduit to Wilson, was the Balfour Declaration, the making of what eventually would be the State of Israel. Okay, so there you have it. This is the formative phase, and this is where the new immigrants after the Civil War, their children coming of age in the 1920s and 30s, or the children born after World War I, and then came of age in the interwar period, would become instrumental in the making of the what they call the newcomers, as you said, in the 1960s. So what happens very quickly again, I mean, the history is very complex, very fluid, and it is the old world. Where George Washington had said, don't get entangled in the politics of the old world, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, who is celebrated by the neocons, took America into the old world. And the question is, will America be able to extricate itself from the old world? And that's the question that is still hanging upon Americans today and the rest of the world, which is what Putin points out. So during the interwar year, what happens? The seeds of the Second World War is laid, and the Second World War takes place, and the alliance that is brought together between the Americans and the Europeans via the British under Churchill is the coming of alliance. The big ally, the allied power, is Joseph Stalin and communist Soviet Union. You know, two things happen. One is the alliance that was in the Second World War, America and the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. But in the prelude to the Second World War is the Depression. And in the Depression years, the Democrats win the election, defeat Herbert Hoover. Uh, and the historical argument is by the time Franklin Roosevelt defeats Herbert Hoover in the 1932 election, the main problem of depression had been tackled with. That is, the manner in which Herbert Hoover managed the economy. It was a question of supply-demand issue, and it was being worked out. But the levels of unemployment that had been reached, that means capital was lying unused, factories were not producing, and so on, was still a challenge. And that's where Roosevelt came up with his New Deal formulation, that is the American version of socialism, the American version of investing through deficit financing. This is the Keynesian revolution, and this is the American version of socialism. And the New Deal started to revive the economy, or at least to hand out support, the welfare network to the unemployment. And the war ultimately lifted America out of the depression, the immense input into production for the war. I mean, Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy. And within a matter of 5 years, America that had no standing army, America that did not have a military infrastructure or military industrial complex, as Eisenhower would call it, suddenly became the giant economy, producing ships, tanks, trucks, guns, everything, the whole material required for modern warfare. It became the arsenal of democracy as President Roosevelt defined America. And that alliance that was built with the Soviet Union and providing the basic manpower. I mean, both America and Britain were sea powers, naval power, no, not a standing army. It was the Soviet army that destroyed the Third Reich. And again, something that people have forgotten. And 27 million people in Soviet Union and or more died in the process of liberating Europe from the fascists, that is from the Nazis. But where does the neocon comes into this? Well, here is where the neocon comes into this. The Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe into America were their children were raised what later on came to be called the red diaper babies. All of these people were coming from Eastern Europe. They were politically inclined towards socialism. And then the Second World War was seen as a war to destroy their existential enemy, that is the Nazis, Hitler. And the Jews, American Jews, and therefore the Democratic Party, were wedded to the support for Stalin and for the Soviet Union, but particularly the American Jews. That was the good war. That was the war that had to be fought, and Germany had to be defeated. And it is from the ranks of the American Jews that Roosevelt filled some of the most important positions in his New Deal government. Later on, there would be the hue and cry of the Republicans like Joe McCarthy that Roosevelt was a crypto a communist or a socialist and so on and so forth, But the point here is there is a very deep and abiding loyalty, a commitment by that segment of the Jews who were left wing. That is the connection that we have to look into. The connection that these people who came of age in the interwar years were Democrats, and then they would rise within their ranks of Democratic Party and outside in civil society into influence. By the time the 1960s come along, they become very important players. And what is it that shifts them to go in the direction which now we see as the New Conservative Party? How is it that the Vietnam War or the 60s became the breach within the ranks of the Democratic Party in the beginning that led to eventually the making of this neoconservative movement? Well, the 60s was the Vietnam War, and the 60s were also the time of great upheaval in American society. There were two things that came together. One was the movement for civil rights, especially in the South and especially with the blacks. So this was a huge movement. Even though the blacks had been emancipated in the Civil War, there was all sorts of obstacles for the blacks in the southern state, the Jim Crow laws, etc. And the civil rights movement came together in the 60s. And then after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the Vietnam War erupted in 1964, and with it began the anti-war demonstration. All of this came to a head in a political sense in the campaign of 1968 when Lyndon Johnson stepped down with the controversy swirling around him over the Vietnam War. And Nixon, the Republicans, took power with what was called his Southern Reach, a Southern campaign, mobilizing what he termed as the silent majority, the whites, because the civil rights movement was led in many sense by the blacks, to which the Jews joined and other ethnic groups joined for civil rights. And the whites in the South and the southern state felt besieged. And Nixon's strategy, the southern strategy, was to mobilize the whites to change the vote from the Democrats to the Republican. And he succeeded. And the 68 election, Nixon became the president after having lost the 1960 election to John F. Kennedy. And the promise of ending the Vietnam War, to take down the anti-war movement, but to end the Vietnam War, as Nixon says, with honor. Peace with honor. And so the war would continue until the Vietnamese were ready to sit down and negotiate a peace. And South Vietnam, that the Americans had invested into, would be there with the support of America. So that was the 72 campaign. 68 was all these rearrangement, and 72 campaign is the critical campaign where the Democrat Party, running against Nixon for his second term, for his re-election, raised the slogan. It was George McGovern, Senator McGovern, a Democrat, a veteran of the Second World War. He was a bomber pilot. So, not somebody, who's a peacenik, but a man with great reputation in his own circle, became the nominee. And his slogan was, "Bring America home. End the Vietnam War. Come back to America. Well, all of this was going on, the Jewish Americans in the Democratic Party became extremely concerned about a whole number of issues. They felt that they were being left behind. As Irving Kristol, who was born in America to the East European Jewish immigrants, by now he was in his 40s, talked about the Democrats being mugged by reality. What was the reality? The anti-war movement, peacenik. What was the other reality? This bring back America home, come home, America. The rise of the civil rights movement with the blacks, and the situation to do with what had followed the World War II was the Cold War, the relationship with the Soviet Union. And these people, who would eventually become identified as neocons, looked at the lay of the land, both in America and outside, in terms of what was the fundamental state of mind, particularly, again, of the Jews, that was happening. And they saw a replay of the 1930s. They saw a replay of the 1930s in the sense the Cold War had identified the Soviet Union as the enemy, and it had to be contained if it could not be rolled back. But by the time of McGovern's campaign, they saw an appeasement taking place. Appeasement was a problem of the 1930s to Hitler. Neville Chamberlain with the lost appeasement from their point of view of Munich and so on and so forth. Instead of containing Hitler and effectively, castrating Hitler and the Nazis and the Third Reich, the Europeans were engaged in appeasement. Appeasement became a bad word. It was to appease the enemy. Whereas in international relation theory, before Second World War, appeasement was a perfectly honorable word. That you and I have
Diplomacy.
you accommodated each other.
Mm-hmm.
So what they saw, so I says, hey, I mean, I'm using these words very carefully. Neocon isn't a coherent ideology. Neocon or neoconservatism is a state of mind, and it is among the American Jews. It is in that
To that point, Salim, we do see a predominance of American Jews in the neoconservative movement, but there are notable exceptions. There are neocons like Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations. A lot of people who lived through the Reagan eras, as we did, remember her saying that we would wave goodbye to the United Nations if they continued on the way they were. And she was a staunch Labor Democrat. And she was flummoxed when Reagan appointed her and brought her onto his team, saying, like, I'm a Democrat. She changed to become a hawkish neoconservative, so much so that her name is associated with that movement predominantly. So while, yes, we talk about groups, particularly the American Jew, the immigrant from the ghettos of Poland, Belarus, Russia, etc., but the movement itself is not monolithic in its membership. And that should be taken into consideration by people who want to think about this movement and the movers and shakers in it.
A good point, but I'm going to qualify it here as I move forward in discussing the genesis of the neocon. Good point. But there would be no neocon if there were not WASP who joined the Jews. Let me read just a passage because this is so relevant from just a couple of sentences from the book Transparent Cabal by Stephen Snigoski. He's writing and quoting Gal Beckerman, who was a Jewish writer, writing in the Jewish newspaper Forward. And Gal Beckerman says, and he's writing this in 2006, so we are discussing history. So he's going back. He's discussing the history of neocon. Says, it is a fact that as a political philosophy, neoconservatism was born among the children of Jewish immigrants and is now largely the intellectual domain of those immigrants' grandchildren. If there is an intellectual movement in America to whose invention Jews can lay sole claim, neoconservatism is it. So as you ask the question, or you remind us about Jean Kirkpatrick in the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Reagan was elected in 1980. The administration came into office in 1981. She was not alone. And by the way, not only Jean Kirkpatrick was a Democrat, Ronald Reagan was a Democrat. Whenever he was talked about it, Ronald Reagan would say, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the Democrats left me. You know, he was there, a Democrat. So it was not only Jean Kirkpatrick and his administration, there were others. There were people like his Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett.
Michael Novak, George Weigel, James Woolsey,
but they were not the administration. They were, intellectual.
CIA directors,
Novak was a Catholic theologian. George Weigel was a Catholic theologian. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was an Irish Catholic who became the senator from New York, but who began his career a Democrat who moved towards the Republican under Richard Nixon. So yes, they were there, but they joined a movement, or within the conservative, there were those ideas, but they were within the traditional conservative party, like Patrick Buchanan, who later on became a candidate for the Reform Party, the precursor of the party that Donald Trump appealed to in his 2015-16 run for the office. And these are all very fascinating. But the neoconservatives are not conservative. In the sense that, Patrick Buchanan was a conservative. He was never a Democrat, or Richard Nixon before Ronald Reagan, who appointed Henry Kissinger his Secretary of State, first National Security Advisor, and then Kissinger. And you might say, in many ways, Henry Kissinger was the leading neocon, except he was practicing the noble lie and did not reveal his own position, right? So, yeah, these are all there at play. But again, the point that the generation of Irving Kristol, who are the intellectual founders of neoconservatism, that means they came of age in the 60s when they were in their mid-years of their life. So they didn't go into politics. They were in the business of ideas. They were professors. They were journalists. They were public intellectuals. Norman Podhoretz, you name, the same age. If you look at the genealogy of these people, it is almost, and I use the word carefully, incestuous. They're married to each other. The wives are also engaged in the work of ideas.
Talk about Victoria Nuland.
Where Victoria Nuland is again their children, their grandchildren. So, Victoria Nuland is in 2014. We are talking about the 1960s. They are either dead or gone or in their 90s now, those who are alive. For instance, Norman Podhoretz is alive and he is in his 90s. But his wife, Mitch Decter, was a very eminent, prominent a founder of neoconservatism in the 1960s, as would be Irving Kristol's wife, who is a highly regarded, and I have read her with great sense of, what should I say, I've read her with great respect. Her books. Gertrude Himmelfarb, I'm talking about. She was a political philosopher and a historian, the mother of Bill Kristol. She um, was, in a sense, the editor of um, what's his name? John Stuart Mill's famous book, on liberty. She wrote the introduction to John Stuart Mill's book on liberty in the Pelican edition, and it is a fabulous introduction. So that again is the cradle in which the children will be raised. And they will come into. We have the Canadian versions of that. We don't have to go into the names. You might talk about them, but so in the 60s, the ferment that began, where all of these people were on the left, the Crystals, the Podhoruses, the Decters, the Donald Kagan, who was the author or the lead author of PNAC, the Project for New American Century, whose children and grandchildren are then the actors. You're talking about Victoria Nuland, married to Robert Kagan, who is the son of Donald Kagan. They come into it. But what happened in the 60s were this confluence of issues that came together or permeated. The Democratic Party, to these people, to which they had dedicated their life, or within the party ranks they had grown up, uh, came to be viewed as with great deal of apprehension, if not fear, that the Democratic Party was engaging in appeasement. Democratic Party is going to turn soft on communism, you know, and in domestically, Democratic Party is nurturing the civil rights movement that is going to intersect with the domestic interests of the Jewish people, with the rise or the coming of age of the blacks, and so on and so forth. So there is this great apprehension, which Irving Kristol phrased it as mugged with reality, you know.
Mm.
So where are they going to go? What is their issues that they are going to pick up on and hammer home? Well, one issue that brings the cabal together, these are all, as I said, the state of mind, because they're reflecting back on the 1920s and 30s with the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, of which they are, in a sense, the victim. But the issue that will bring them together because of who they are is Israel, is Zionism. So it is not Kirkpatrick or Pat Buchanan or Bill Bennett and others who have this issue in their mind. In fact, when we go back to trace these arguments, their predecessors as conservatives or as Democrats oppose the making of Israel. It was Truman who was bought over by the money of the Jewish lobby in 1948, whereas all the senior members of his government, the Secretary of State, George Marshall, the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, the heads of department in the State Department, people like Loy Henderson, they all counseled against the partition of Palestine and then subsequently the recognition of Israel in 1948. These are all.
And fast forward to today, we still have it on our plate, primarily, I would suggest, because we have, what is it, 80 million Christian conservatives in the United States who believe the biblical prophecy that when the Jews return to Zion, Jesus will come down to the Mount of Olives and then you'll have the rapture. So they have to appeal to that huge lobby to get elected. And Donald Trump appeals to that huge lobby too.
Well, again, you're right. but the prominence of the Christian Zionists in American politics is a phenomena that comes together with the upheavals of the 1960s and after. You don't hear about them. I mean, the Christian Zionist or the evangelical Christian, from the point of view of the WASP elite, is looked upon as, again, the rabble rousers on the margins of the American society. The great classic on this subject is by Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in the 1930s, and his book Elmer Gantry, the Southern Baptist preacher, evangelical. That's the fictional character, but the fictional character is based upon real characters, It was subsequently made into a movie. And Elmer Gantry is a demagogue, you know, hell and fire breathing demagogue, and in those days that Sinclair Lewis was portraying is at the turn of the century. These people were the know-nothings, and they were using Christianity as a tool to mobilize the know-nothings, that is the rabble. So that segment from within which comes the Christian Zionist movement was there, but it was not a factor in the manner in which it became a factor in the post-1960 phase with the outreach by Nixon. And then later on, with Reagan, Jerry Falwell and the whole lot that came in, the moral majority, and etc.
Now, we could not call these people neoconservatives as such, the Christian Zionists, right? I
No,
don't
they're
think
not
they're neoconservatives.
neoconservative. They have their own interests.
Yeah, but remember we talked about one of the characteristics of neoconservatism is the imposition of Jeffersonian style democracy throughout the world, whether people want it or not, whether it goes against their culture and tradition and their history or not. Could it be seen that the UN Resolution 181, which allowed for Israel to exist, be the result of a neoconservative lobby? Mind you, this is back in 1947, so it predates modern neoconservatism. But I look at it as a democratic state in the Middle East, which does not have a history of being democratic. Could this be a neoconservative link as well?
The issue that we are talking about in terms of the genesis of neocon, these might be issues below the radar. It is only in the mind of the Jews and the Zionist Jews, because if you start getting into the granular, the Zionist Jews were not the majority in American politics, because the Jews, American Jews, in numbers opposed Zionism. In fact, in the 1930s, coming into the Second World War, and again, all of this is now forgotten or has been airbrushed away by the Zionists. The largest segment of the American Jews were Reform Jews. That, in other words, they were Jews whose ancestors, whose background was in Germany. They were German Jews. Germany was one of the most emancipated European state when it came into being in the 1870s. It was the great enlightenment in European history, Germany, and the Jews of Germany saw themselves as Germans. And they integrated or sought to integrate into the German culture and proudly looked at themselves as Germans. One of the most famous German Jew in this period, 19th century, late early 19th century, is Moses Mendelssohn, or German great German poet Heinrich Heine. They were Jews, but you wouldn't know they were Jews because they saw themselves as Germans, you know. It was their language, their contribution in music and art and science. I mean, think about it. Einstein and a whole lot of others, writers and poets and musicians, they were part of Germany. And they were Germans. They frowned upon the Eastern European Jews, you know. That they were coming out of the ghettos, you know. They were the uneducated. They were the, you know, the word Haradim and Hasidic were, in a sense, you know, uh, epithets of, I don't want to say abuse, but dismissal. You know, the civilized, the cultured Jew were German Jews, and of course, English Jews. And so when the whole issue of Israel comes into being, it becomes part of the American politics during the Roosevelt years, that is Franklin Roosevelt, the strongest voices against that came from the American Jewish Committee. People like one of the leading members of the American Jewish Committee was Rabbi Elmer Berger and his writing, or Judah Magnus and his writing, who I believe ended up being one of the top guns in the academic professor in Harvard, I believe. I could be mistaken, but he came from California, and he went to Israel in the 1930s. He's the founder of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Judah Magnus, an American Jew. American Jew, that means in the sense that the great immigration that took place, as I was pointing out, after the Civil War, his family came from Central Europe, and he was born in California. Judah Magnus and another German Jew, Rabbi Martin Buber, philosopher, highly respected, you know, the same generation as Einstein. As Einstein was part of this group, openly opposed the Zionists for all sorts of reasons, including this whole mythological aspect of the Bronze Age civilization, that there was a covenant and they are a chosen people and a 3,000-year history, and that's what is to be led to the making of Israel. They opposed it. You know, it's all in the documentation. And what did Judah Magnus, an American from California via Harvard, who was one of the most highly respected American Jews with access to the top guns in American politics, all the way to Franklin Roosevelt. Just as I said, you know, I mean, that was what was cultivated by the Democrats, you know, again, ethnic politics, which is what the Republicans didn't do. The Republicans have tried to now follow that position, as the conservative in Canada is trying to follow, have tried to follow the liberal connection. So again, there are these parallels. Judah Magnus and Martin Buber were the leaders of the binational state. You know, they opposed partition. If there was going to be a state, it must be a binational state, an Arab-Jewish state. Because among the Arabs, that is the Palestinians, there was a very large segment of Christians. People forget that. They simply look at the Arabs as Muslims, you know. And so there is that whole other dynamic of making and looking at the Muslim that goes back to the Crusades as the infidels or as the lesser people and so on and so forth. I mean, that is again part of the history of the West, to demonize the other.
Can you
So
try to, can we,
demonize, the Muslims have been demonized.
let's try to make a connection, Salim, between the movement to the creation of Israel, Zionism,
Yeah.
and the neoconservatism, which is more or less the topic of today, because the
Yes.
two are related. So how are they related? Because the creation of Israel is 47, but we see a lot of neoconservatives today, not only with their fingers in Ukraine and everywhere else in the world, but specifically in the Middle East.
No, it is the Middle East because the neocons are Jews. As I just pointed out, as we are pointing out, that the neocons are not Italians, the neocons are not Australians. For heaven's sake, they're Jews. Other people will join them for their own interests, and that's what we're coming to. Why did they join them? Because 60s is not the Reagan years. That's 80s. A lot of things happened between the 60s and 80s. So the Irving Kristol and the Norman Podhoruses are concerned about the Democratic Party and which way it is going. This concern began with John F. K. We haven't even scratched the surface of the assassination of John F. K. and who were involved in it and what was involved in it. Because that's, again, a Pandora's box, right? It's a taboo subject. And we'll leave it at that. But the concern is for these intellectuals, men of ideas, women of ideas, is what is the future of the Jews in America? If the Jews are engaged in appeasement of whom? Communism, Soviet Union. And then they're concerned always, because that's where the beginning is, with the question of a Jewish state and when the Jewish state is created in 1948. That concern doesn't belong to Joe McCarthy, nor does it belong to people who are the head of the Democratic Party, except for Truman, who has been bought over by the Zionists, and that's another fascinating story. So if Franklin Roosevelt had been alive and not died under conditions that is again open to debate in 1945, before the war ended, then the question, what if, is there? Legitimate question. Would there have been a Cold War? Would there have been the partition of Palestine and the immediate recognition by America of Israel? Because in both issues, there's enough material to conjecture the possibility, again, credible possibility, that Roosevelt would not have taken the path that was taken by Truman.
We did a whole video discussion on this, that Truman took the Russians, who were our allies, and dropped the two bombs on Japan specifically to put the fear of God into Russia, who he was setting up to be our next enemy.
Right. So that's on
And
the.
I don't mean Russia specifically. I mean the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union. We're talking about Soviet Union.
Yes.
This is the period. Russia comes into being after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So again, we have the advantage of looking back. They don't have the advantage of looking forward. There's no crystal ball. So the ideas have to be contextualized, and that's what you and I are trying to do. So in the 60s, and the Vietnam War is going on. In 1967, there was the June War with the Arab-Israeli War. And again, that is a very mixed bag of issues. Was it a war that was, again, based upon false flag and preemption by the Israelis, or was it a war that was pushed by the Arabs, in this case, Egypt, Israel? There's a whole issue of USS Liberty there that nobody wants to touch it. And so there is that 67 war, followed by 6 years later, the 1973 war. Nixon is still in office. The issues had begun percolating from the Jewish point of view, that is what will become the neocon point of view, the concern about America. Which way is America headed? Is it going to be appeasement of the Soviet Union, of communism, or in relationship to Israel, the Soviet Union is backing materially, diplomatically, financially, the Arab states, principally Egypt, that is, from the Jewish point of view, the enemy of Israel, And so you have the Soviet Union engage in politics of the Middle East, what is the Americans going to do? How are they going to do? It is in these sort of situation and concern that the theory of neoconservatism is forged, is formulated, that comes into being after the end of the Cold War. So remember, in the Cold War years, the concern is about Soviet communism, that is a legacy of Truman's decision, as Truman was coached into this position by Winston Churchill. Okay? And we haven't even touched upon that. Second World War, the British Empire is over, but the British Empire lives on in the body of American politics via Winston Churchill. In other words, one empire dies, and as you mentioned, there's between 800 and 900 bases around the world. What is that base? What are those bases protecting? The bases are protecting what is the new empire that is born over the dead body of the British Empire, that is the American Empire, and the influence of the British. It is like the question or the history of the end of the Greek and the Hellenic age, that is Athens as the center of the Mediterranean civilization, and the rise of Rome and the Roman Empire. So Athens becomes the teacher of Rome. London becomes the teacher of Washington. And what did George Washington say? Don't get involved with the old world.
Adams as well, when he was Secretary of State, said, we do not do this. What did he call it? Enter this Akeldama, a field of blood, which is Europe. Like, do not go there.
That's right.
So I just want to wrap this up, Salim. We've been talking for almost 2 hours on it now, and I think that we have to have another couple of discussions on this at least. It's such a prevailing policy decision on the part of the states, developed over decades, which we're seeing throughout the world, and it is the underlying, not an ideology per se, but policy decision of neoconservatism. And I'll bring it back to Putin again, because he's also mentioned, besides Victoria Nuland, and to remind people, Victoria Nuland was the Assistant Secretary of State under Obama, who was present during the Maidan Revolution in 2014 in Kyiv, where she was handing out cookies while she was orchestrating a regime change. A successful regime change, which is a neoconservative tactic, to bring in somebody who was opposed to Russia. And now we have Zelensky, and this whole war, again, 1 million casualties, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. Why? Neoconservatism and the advance of Jeffersonian democracy and the destruction of Russia. It's such a complicated affair. But Putin also mentioned, believe it or not, because he's such a great student of history, as we know from the Tucker interview, a Karl Gershman and the National Endowment for Democracy, also co-founded by Alan Weinstein. So I looked up the National Endowment for Democracy, which is supposedly quasi-private, quasi-government. It's funded by Congress to a large degree. And here's what I found online. It said, upon its founding, the National Endowment for Democracy assumed several former activities of the CIA. And political groups, activists, academics, and some governments have accused the National Endowment for Democracy of being an instrument of U.S. foreign policy helping to foster regime change. So here we have Putin, again, going back to our beginning of our discussion, identifying the people and the organizations responsible for the death and carnage that is now going on in Ukraine. So let's talk about Putin and his understanding of neoconservatism and the foreign policy that they espouse. Compare that to the absolute ignorance of the American, Canadian, British people when it comes to these people and the philosophy of neoconservatism. What an odd dichotomy here we have. A Russian president knows more about American foreign policy because he sees the ideology and the philosophy behind it, and we don't as a people.
Well, it is not odd. It is, in fact, um, something that is to be expected. And I've spoken about this with you, I think, in one of our broadcasts on the Ukraine war, and we might spend some time in the future getting into greater details and the granular details. That two things. One is the neocons, as we spend this part of our conversation going back to the Genesis, that they are, first of all, immigrants into America after the Civil War from Eastern Europe. And we're talking specifically, when we're talking about the neocon, they're Jews from Eastern Europe. And so the Pale of Settlement constituted where the Jews were to be found in number in Eastern
Is that
Europe.
what this is? Vengeance?
Well,
Vengeance against Russia?
so yeah, exactly. So from the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, from mainland Russia, the Russian Empire, Tsarist Empire, and then the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet Union. And the Eastern European states of Poland and Hungary and Romania and so on. These are the immigrants who came, the Jewish immigrants who came in the 1880s and thereafter. It is the children who were raised in the interwar years. And we are now talking about, when you talk about, as you refer, as Putin is referring, Nuland, they are their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, So it is, again, the ethnic politics, the demography of these people, where they're coming from, the ideas and the baggage with which they come. So as I said, it is a state of mind, their history, and their, drive eventually to where they have arrived. That is, they are the helmsmen. They are in the control of the machine of the American foreign policy. They began as immigrants, running away from that part of the world. And in 4 generations, from the 1880s to the 21st century, roughly 4 generations, they have reached the apex of the American society, and in terms of foreign policy, they are the drivers of the foreign policy. How did this come about? And that's what I was discussing with you. So now that you look back upon it, Putin, of course, knows them. Putin knows them in terms of the historical origin. Putin knows them of what is their grievances. And what is the grievances? They are going to take revenge upon the forces that basically brought about the exile or the emigration of their ancestors.
I can't believe it. That's so childish. And
Was that?
it's so stupid. It's so childish. None of these people exist anymore. Oh, they're all in the grave, and yet you're seeking vengeance for the actions
Well,
of.
it is childish in the sense you can say, what are the great grandchildren trying to do? Reverse the history of whatever. We are living in a different world, but we are now talking about power, influence, politics. Um, Look, it's a very interesting comparative analogy or analysis. As I said right at the beginning, the largest segment of ethnically of Americans before the Civil War were German Americans. And again, concentrated in the East Coast, Or maybe we can run the name. Eisenhower, Nimitz, and so on, from the Second World War, or even in the First World War. They were German Americans, but they went to fight Germany. They went to fight Germany in First World War. They went to fight Germany in the Second World War. Italians who migrated. Italians went to fight Italy. They went to fight Mussolini, you know. So again, there is a parallel. In the case of the Jews, they were, who becomes neocons, they were left-wing. They grew up with the ideology in their own ghettos. So there were two strains of thoughts or ideas that competed for the political loyalty of the Jews in Eastern Europe. One was Marxism, anarchism, and so on. That's radical politics. And they'd cause havoc, and they did the assassination of czars and ministers in the Russian government. And if anyone reads Solzhenitsyn's classic on this subject, which is not available in English, except that portions of it have been translated 200 years, in which Solzhenitsyn talks about the Jewish and Russian relationship, he says that the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution was not an internal affair, was not a revolution. It was an invasion, an occupation by the Bolsheviks. And who were the Bolsheviks? They were the Jews in the primary sense. Again, primary sense, because there were non-Jews too. Stalin was not a Jew. But almost 40%, if not more, and again, Russia is a continent at the time, Tsarist time, of the Central Committee and later the Politburo of the party, the Communist Party, or what became Communist Party of Soviet Union, but before that it was the Bolshevik, were Jews, and so as Solzhenitsyn writes, this was an occupation, this was an invasion. A foreign body seized upon through warfare, Russia, eliminated the Tsar and his entire family, and brought about the destruction of Russia, in effect. The Holodomor in Russia, the famine of Ukraine, were carried out by the Jewish members of the Bolshevik Party. Now, why they did that is another subject, but these have all been forgotten and laid upon, So their children, their grandchildren born in America have their eyes back to their ancestral lands and their connection. But in the case of Soviet Union became an ally after the 1941 invasion by Germany, by Hitler, Operation Barbarossa into Russia or Soviet Union, became an ally. And for the Jews in America, support for Soviet Union was critical, because that support was needed to defeat Hitler, the other enemy of Jews, So there was and their children are known as red diaper baby, because they were born in households that were basically pro-Soviet Union, pro-communist, pro-Leninist, But now if you go deeper into the post-war situation, most of these people who were pro-Soviet were also anti-Stalin. They were pro-Trotsky. Trotsky was a Jew, David Bronstein, who went from New York to Tsarist Russia to become part of the revolution. It was Jews in New York, in the Wall Street, who supported the Bolshevik Revolution to overthrow the Tsars. One of the most important names among the Wall Street lawyers and bankers was Jacob Schiff, who provided millions of dollars to the Bolshevik Party, who supported Trotsky to go to Soviet Union. And Trotsky became the head of the Red Army in the wars that followed. Okay, but Trotsky and Stalin split after the death of um, Lenin, and there was a long struggle between the two of them, and ultimately Stalin prevailed and he emerged. But this was not simply a struggle between two people not getting along with each other, but both committed to the same idea. That is Marxism Leninism. That was the sacred scripture of the Bolshevik Revolution. No, there was a question of, as it happens, you know, about how you're going to interpret and apply the sacred scripture of Marxism Leninism. And for Trotsky, uh, Russia was a backward country, but Russia would simply be a platform for what? For world revolution. The Russian victory or the Bolshevik victory in Tsarist Russia would then be the ignition, the prairie fire, so to speak, that will create the bigger fire, because socialism has to come in an advanced industrial economy, not in a peasant economy. Russia was the most backward economy. China was
Social
more backward.
Socialism relies on it's a parasitic system, and it relies on a host, and you have to have that industrial host to
Exactly. I
be a
mean,
parasite on.
also the developed country, industrial development, because these are the stages of modernization or the mode of production. Slave society, bourgeois society, and capitalist society, then the socialist society, then the communist society. And what distinguishes each level of society is technology, science, industrialization. And revolution happened in Tsarist Russia because of World War I, the exhaustion of Tsarist Russia in that war. And again, you see, ideas have consequences, and unintended consequences are the one that comes to dominate history. What was the business of the Tsar to go to war against Austria-Hungary to give the notice in July because the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary had been assassinated by a Serbian? Well, the Serbians were Orthodox Christian, and Tsarist Russia, Tsar was the patriarch of Orthodoxy. So that led him, and so that led the Germans, and that on and on. So that was the combustion that took place. That was World War I. But back to the debate between Trotsky and Stalin, or between the two factions that competed for power in the Russia after the death of Lenin. Trotsky argued for world revolution. And his people, that is the Bolshevik, his people mean the party, the Communist Party, the largest communist socialist party in Europe was the party in Germany. And that exploded after World War I in the armistice. There was an uprising in Germany led by people like Rosa Luxemburg, the communist leader, that was crushed by the Weimar Republic, by the army of the post-war Germany, the Weimar. But the idea of world revolution was Trotsky's position. No, we have to support the world revolution. And Stalin's proposition was no, socialism in one country. So we're not going to be world revolution. We have to build socialism in Russia. And in that conflict, Stalin prevailed. So all these Marxist, Leninist, pro-revolutionary people of Jewish origin, Eastern European origin in America, who had supported the Bolshevik Revolution following the split between Trotsky and Stalin, were Trotskyite. But all of that division was repressed, suppressed, because now my enemy's enemy is my friend. This is not an Arab slogan. It is an axiom of politics. You make alliance with my enemy's enemy again, yeah, as a friend against the principal enemy. So it was suppressed because now the enemy was not Stalin, it was Hitler. In the period after Second World War, Israel is an issue. But as I told you, there was a lot of Jews who did not want to have this. So it is not, as I used to remind my students when discussing these things, you cannot be more Catholic than the Catholic.
Or the
You
Pope.
cannot be more Pope, than the Pope. You cannot be more Jew or more Muslim than the Jew or the Muslim. So we are talking about the Jews in America. And the Jews, the greater part of the Jews were against all of this because they had assimilated into America. They were Americans who happened to be Jewish. This was the golden age of Judaism. It was a Jewish rabbi, a Reform rabbi, Rabbi Jacob Neusner, who called and wrote about the golden age of Jews in modern history. One of the golden age of Jews was in Spain, Andalusia, where Jews and Muslims, that is Arabs, came together. That was the golden age. And then the next golden age, in between, is all the problems of Jews in the Christendom. Then comes the next golden age, and this is in America, you know. And so they didn't want to get involved in all of this thing, that had been raised up, which was actually an imperial project in the name of Judaism or Jews, Zionism. Because the only Jew that was in the British War Cabinet representing the Jews of England voted against Balfour Declaration, Edwin Montagu. The religious Jews didn't want to have anything of this. So this was the secular atheist Jews for whom this was the project, Zionism, in Europe, not in America. So it is the Eastern European Jews who brought this idea into America.
And not only not in America, but if you read the King Crane Commission, and I'm speaking to our listening audience here, or the viewing audience, because we've read it, the Jews and the people in Palestine at the time did not want a state of Israel either, a Jewish state. But that King Crane Commission was suppressed.
Right. I mean, it was never put to a vote that this is what the British have done. They have divided places up as an empire and parceled off territories or land to their favorites because they will follow their interests. They did that in India. Nobody asked the Indian people whether they want the division of India, partition of India. There was no referendum. They did that in Palestine. They did that in all of Africa. Nobody asked, how is Kenya created? How is Nigeria created? What is, Tanzania, etc.
Well, when it comes down to it, nobody asked the people of Alberta in 1905 if they wanted to be part of Canada, or the people in each individual state whether or not they wanted to be part of the United States. It was always up to the elite,
Exactly.
the
So
officials.
going away, but there are different avenues that you go away, and there's a history. But coming back to the neocons, the concern, the state of mind after the Second World War, there is for the neocons, it is Israel. That's the important thing. But that is not the important thing yet in America. That will become an important thing as the neocon gathers strength. So in the 60s, it is Soviet Union. The concern among the people like Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol and Donald Kagan and the whole lot of them, it's a small group of people, by the way. The Bolsheviks were a small group of people too. So what is concerning them, what is agitating their mind as they seek to build up a policy position, is primary concern of the Americans as they get into what becomes the Cold War. Remember, John F. Kennedy tried to bring an end to it after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He got assassinated for it, murdered for it. So this Cold War issue is the biggest issue. And these people see that people like George McGovern and Hubert Humphrey, in fact, the man who possibly was the first to use the name neoconservative in the 1960s to define this element within the Democratic Party, that is the Jewish element, as neoconservative, was a man by the name of Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington, again an Irish American by origin, was a professor in New York. I believe the City University in New York, an author of several very fine books that I read as an undergraduate. He was a New Deal American, a very solid supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, but he represented what was the American Socialist Party that was with another party inside the Democratic Party, and his group of people became known as Americans for Democratic Action, So it was again a left-wing party. And Michael Harrington was a very well-respected academic. I mean, there is a long strain of people in American politics on the Democratic side who were socialists, going back famously to Eugene Debs, who ran for the presidency in the 1920s as a socialist. And it is said that if socialism come, it will come wrapped in American flag, or as it is said that if fascism come to America, it will come wrapped in an American flag with the Bible as their marching tool. So that's the Christian Zionist. And Elmer Gantry, the fictionalized person. So these people calling for an end to the war in Vietnam, calling for America come home, where the amber light flashing or red light flashing in the head of the future representation of neocons, but the founders of neocon, of appeasement. Okay, so if you're going to appease the Soviet Union, immediately there's a danger to Israel because they're supporting the Arab state against Israel. So that is a given. So that's an axiomatic, about this. And so they start looking for a new home. But the new home is not there. They don't want to have anything to do with the Republican, because Republicans are seen to be not only the WASP elite, they are the country club owners, They are playing the golf and the country club where the Jews don't have access to. I mean, there is still that element of bigotry, and separation of class in American politics. And so where are they going to go? Well, many of them, especially the sons and daughters of Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, they are now going to the university. They become the students of Leo Strauss, and then they become interns of some of the congressmen and senators, coming out on the Democratic side, the Democratic aisle. And the most important, in that sense, the most famous senator who pulled all these young men into his team is Senator Henry Jackson, who was first elected as congressman from Washington, state of Washington, in 1941. And then he was elected as a senator, I believe, in 1953. Under the new provision, as you talked about, the change that had taken place. So this man goes back to 1941. He's a Democrat. He was a New Deal Democrat. But under Truman, he becomes a hardcore warrior. He is totally devoted to taking down the Soviet Union. He came to be known as the senator from Boeing, because Boeing was based in Washington, so he was backed up by Boeing. And what has happened between the end of the war and the 1960s? Well, Eisenhower spoke about it, the rise of military-industrial complex. There was no military-industrial complex before 1939. There was no standing army before 1939. The Second World War changed all of that. America became the arsenal of democracy. The General Motors, this is a famous line from the chairman of General Motors, Charles Wilson, um, who was at that time the president and CEO during the war of General Motors. He said, what is the business of America is the business of General Motors, and what is the business of General Motors is the business of America. So there it is. And Charlie Wilson would later on become the Secretary of Defense for Eisenhower. He would serve one term in Eisenhower administration, Secretary of Defense. And it's Eisenhower who is warning about the military-industrial complex. And what is the component of the military-industrial complex? One of the if the military-industrial complex is to survive and grow and profit, it needs wars. And so that's where we are. We are entering into. That's where the Vietnam War comes in. That's where the Korean War comes in. And there's the other thing. There was no CIA before the Second World War. This is a new thing that is created. Under the influence of the British, the Office of Strategic Service, OSS, which is simply pulling together people who knew the world. And it was a Canadian who was there. I'm forgetting his name. His name will come to me. Who was asked by Elliott Roosevelt to pull together a group of people, who was introduced by Winston Churchill to Elliott Roosevelt, and he then pulls together the OSS, and OSS then becomes the genesis of what will be the CIA, that would be talked about as the invisible government, and we now know where the CIA is. So you see, it's if you're going to have a large police force, you need to have criminals. So you create criminals. If you're going to have a large penitentiary, then you need to have criminals to, be put into the penitentiary. So these are all feedbacks, all the dialectics. So that's where the question of perpetual wars comes in. Perpetual war for perpetual peace. Not a peace that you're going to get, but perpetual peace. And the American state, the American Republic, start drifting away from the foundational principle of George Washington not to be entangled with the affairs of the world, or the statement that was subsequently made by the son of John Adams, the second president who becomes the sixth president, John Quincy Adams, that we don't go searching for monsters. Our concern is to build America as a democracy, and that is what led to the Monroe Doctrine, to keep America out of the old world, But all of that was breached by Woodrow Wilson taking America into World War I, Franklin Roosevelt into World War II, Harry Truman into the Cold War and the Korean War, Lyndon Johnson into the Vietnam War. You see, all Democrat presidents, and the Republicans are saddled with those wars and have to try to find an end to it. Or by the time we are talking, that is the period after JFK's assassination, there has been no single president in America. And now, he's president-elect, but for his first term, I would say not even Donald Trump in the first term, who has gone against the military-industrial complex, which is now defined as the deep state, right? So we have to keep that in mind. It is in that context emerges the neocon ideology and PNAC, because once the Cold War is over, during the Cold War, that is Nixon administration, he defeats McGovern. his second term. So the coming home is not, it's been rejected, defeated, but the idea is percolating. He is bound to make peace with honor, but the main issue is the Soviet Union. And what is Nixon's strategy? Or he picks up the strategy from the slain President John F. Kennedy, against whom he had run in 1960, is detente. That is peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, which means, building down the weapons. That is negotiating nuclear treaties. Who is the man charged to do that? Henry Kissinger. So the SALT negotiation, the strategic arms limitation talk, the ABM negotiation, the anti-ballistic missiles treaty, the non-proliferation treaty, etc., were all put on the table during the Nixon administration and carried forward during the Jimmy Carter administration, and the newcons were appalled because this was the evidence of the what you call appeasement of Soviet Union. Then the man who was inside the Senate, there was a whole group of senators, but the man among the Democrats who was the staunchest opponent of detente was Senator Henry Jackson. So Senator Henry Jackson became the man who brought in all these young interns at the age of 19, 20, 21, into Washington, and gave them position, gave them responsibilities, what the interns do besides carrying the bag, the briefcase for the senator. They get into making networks. They get into getting to know people, and among them were people like Wolfowitz, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Fate, David Wormser, and so on and so forth, But their fathers were the people who were the ideas people, the Irving Kristol, the Norman Podhoretz. Norman Podhoretz became the editor-in-chief of the leading Zionist magazine in America, and which still is, that is the Commentary magazine. And when he retired, he handed the editorship to his son, John Podhoretz, So the ideas were all, in a sense, in the process of being put together. One of the ideas was that, you cannot allow this build down, this detente, but you cannot go against the president, and you cannot go against the sentiment of the people who had voted for him twice. So you put in other ideas into there to either dilute it or to derail it, and Senator Scoop Jackson did. The idea that he put forward was what is known as the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, that any engagement, negotiation with Soviet Union on the critical issues of peaceful coexistence in terms of armaments, missiles, and so on, must be premised upon the good behavior of the Soviet Union in terms of human rights. And what was the issue in the late 1960s and early 1970s? Emigration out of Soviet Union. Who are the ones that is being pushed for being allowed to leave Soviet Union? The Russian Jews. That amendment was passed against the opposition of Nixon and Kissinger. But that was the amendment that Henry Scoop Jackson pushed with the support of the newcons. That was the beginning of the shift, of coming together. Of it is like a tiger that tastes human blood, and then that becomes a man-eating tiger because he
Good analogy.
tastes salt.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the beginning. So by the time now, with the failed presidency of Nixon, because he was almost impeached, he resigned and left. And then the president, Gerald Ford, lost. Jimmy Carter becomes the president in 1976. Jimmy Carter carries on with the policy of detente. He wants detan. He does the SALT II negotiation. And then he wants to find a resolution of the conflict in the Middle East. He wants to bring together and find a solution, and the newcomers don't like that, you see. And so Jimmy Carter is defeated. But he's defeated, ironically, on what happens in Iran, with the coming back of the Islamic regime by the overthrow of the Shah under Ayatollah Khomeini and the hostage crisis that leads to Jimmy Carter's defeat and the coming of the Reagan administration. And it is during the Reagan administration that the policy of buildup of the Americans' nuclear weapons in general, is put into place. And that's where the newcomers starts becoming a factor. They had done their internship under Henry Jackson, and then the interim was the Carter administration, and then comes the Reagan administration, the network they had built, because that's what is required to get your name, your curriculum into circulation within an incoming administration. And people like Wolfowitz, Faith, and others got appointments at the third level of the administration, that is, Assistant Secretary of State, Under Assistant Secretary of State, in whatever department, but they're percolating forward. And as Reagan's administration hardens, at least in the first term, hardens toward the Soviet Union, starts supporting regime changes in Central America, the Nicaragua conflict and so on. Cuba is still the burr in the saddle, the whole problem with Cuba, with Fidel Castro. But then comes the Afghan war with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It happened under Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter was not there. It was in 1979, but it is the Reagan administration. And so the confrontation with the Reagan administration, the support for the freedom fighters, quote unquote, who become the precursors of the Al-Qaeda, the ISIS, all the various terrorist organizations. So that leads to a whole different discussion we need to have, which, because that culminates with 9/11, so whether it was an inside job or what happened, that is a thing. But all of this congeals, comes together from the point of view of the neocons, the building up of America. Ronald Reagan calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, the war in Afghanistan, the funding of that, what is that leading to? It is leading to the consolidation of military-industrial complex. It is leading to the consolidation of the CIA, the intelligence agencies. It is leading to buying into the idea that the containment has not only to be solidified, but expanded, to defeat the Soviet Union. My enemy's enemy is my friend. Nixon had played that card with Kissinger on the question of China. He recognized China. He split the Soviet Union from China, the two communist countries, the two great powers on the Eurasian landmass. So now you're dealing only with the Soviet Union. China has been separated, and you can bring about the defeat of the Soviet Union, which had happened. Now we can look back. That's what happened. Gorbachev came, Soviet Union imploded, and the Cold War has ended. With the Cold War being ended, where will the investment for the military-industrial complex come from?
You have to create new enemies.
That's right. So the containment, the entire strategy, half a century strategy of containment, that was worked out by whom? By the WASP, the conservatives. Whether they were with the Democrat Party or the Republican Party, it didn't matter, because they were the people in the State Department. The most famous man is George Kennan. but people like Dean Acheson, Robert Lovett, and others. So these were the people, they were the traditional conservatives. They were America First people. In the America First movement, they were Americans. They were not going to go looking out for monsters to destroy, you know. And what is this whole notion that we can talk about later about exporting democracy? You know, democracy is the people's government. How do you export that? How do you implant democracy, whether it's Jeffersonian democracy or Wilsonian democracy? How do you implant it in Afghanistan or Nicaragua or Sudan or wherever? You have relationships with countries. The world is a world of nation states. Since the Treaty of Westphalia, that idea of a nation state has become universal. And Second World War is the end of empires. But lo and behold, as you said in your opening remark, we are dealing with 800 to 900 American bases. America, the great republic, the beacon of a nation state based upon constitutional ideas, where the word democracy is used. And by the way, we have to come back to talk about exceptionalism, because that's the term that is imported, not by the founding fathers, because there is nowhere you will find in the literature of the founding fathers the word exceptional. Because what makes anybody exceptional? Are we going to have a two-tier legal system? It's a rule of law we are talking about. Rule of law comes from the Constitution. Where did this word come from? There is the role of the neocons. So there was the military-industrial complex, the ruling class in America, the ruling elite, all the president, Democrats and Republicans after JFK, are all joined at the hip together in maintaining America power in the age of the Cold War, which is a bipolar world. The age has ended. So where is it? A new idea will come for to give the legitimacy to the deep state, the military-industrial complex, that we have monsters to deal with. Soviet Union was a monster. It was defined as a monster, Stalin became a good example of a monster with his gulag and so on and so forth. But now, where are you going to find it? You have made peace with China. Soviet Union has collapsed. So the new ideology that is needed, just as the ideas of containment was a new ideology. It was not an ideology that came out of Franklin Roosevelt and his people. It came out from Truman, by the way of Winston Churchill when he talked about the Iron Curtain has descended from the Baltics to the Adriatic. Well, the Iron Curtain had descended only a month after the other power has defeated the Third Reich. It's like on a flip of a coin, the enemy has changed.
Yes.
So now that enemy has fallen apart. So where is the new enemy going to come? Well, that's where, you might want to stop here. That's where we go into the project for the new American century.
That is a good place to stop, but I'll just end, I think, by referring back to Plato's a noble lie. Remember that it is a lie. It is not true that there is a class of people that are fit to govern others, that are filled with gold and the rest of us with bronze and silver. And we should know that it is a lie. These people who have the heirs of the Congress and the heirs of presidents and generals and the public at large through the media, these are liars. They are unfit to be our guardians. And it is only because, I think, Salim, that we have today platforms that can put out counter ideas as you're expressing here today, that there's hope that these lies will be identified as such. And not just the lie about the elites, but the lies they tell, the stories they tell, the lies they tell about Russia, about the Middle East, about Taiwan, communist China, all of the rest, the lies about the whole world, the Gulf of Tonkin, the invasion of Pearl Harbor that we're learning about, the assassination of JFK, 9/11. All of these lies are being torn down bit by bit because we've been given a platform like X and Rumble, not YouTube, Rumble and BitChute and social media and the internet to expose the noble lies. Thank you very much, Salim. My head is spinning. I don't know about anybody else's if they've lasted this long, but my head is spinning. So thank you. Thank you very much, Salim.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.